si pensaron que este era un estado débil y que íbamos a ceder a presiones internacionales, se equivocaron, porque ahora van a conocer la fuerza de nuestros elementos.
Gunfire rains down on the streets of LA, while gangs spread drugs and crime clashes with law enforcement. Many years later, the descendants of these gang wars take us to a maximum security prison holding 40,000 inmates. Here, a few times gangs messed with the wrong people. LAPD versus street gangs. Operation Hammer.
This is crack cocaine. It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones.
In the late 70s, the Los Angeles Police Department had established CRASH to combat gang-related crime and violence in the city. Now, formed in the late 70s, this unit gained notoriety for its aggressive tactics and significant impact on gang activity. However, it would also become infamous for widespread corruption, leading to the Rampart scandal in the late 90s, which exposed a lot of police misconduct within that unit. In April 1987, the CRASH unit, aka Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, started Operation Hammer, a special operation created as a major effort to curb gang violence in LA, California. The roots of this operation trace back to the '84 Olympics in LA. Under Chief Gates' direction, the LAPD expanded gang sweeps during the Olympics, specifically targeting South Central and East LA. Post-Olympics, the department revived old anti-syndicalist laws to continue the stringent security measures, leading to frequent mass arrests of Black and Hispanic youth. There were lots of arrests, but most of these people were never charged. Citizen complaints about police brutality tripled from 1984 to 1989.
We have a war, a shooting war, not in the Middle East right now. We have it on the streets of every major city in this country.
CRASH would get involved with all the classic gangs in the LA area, most notable, the Crips, one of the largest and most notorious street gangs in LA, with numerous subgroups or sets. They were heavily involved in drug trafficking, violence, and other criminal activities, which leads to the Bloods, another major gang considered to be arch rivals to the Crips. The Bloods are consisted of multiple sets as well, and are deeply involved in criminal enterprises, leading to frequent clashes with the CRASH operatives. And this takes us to the 18th Street Gang, one of the largest Hispanic street gangs in LA, known for their involvement in all sorts of illegal stuff. This gang's extensive network and criminal operation made them a significant focus for this unit. And also MS-13, or Mara Salvatrucha, a violent, rapidly growing multicellular gang with roots from El Salvador, quickly developing across Central America. MS-13s become a significant force in LA. Their activities range from drug trafficking, extortion, and violence to numerous confrontations with this unit. A year into this initiative, the LA Times reported a significant decline in gang violence in certain areas of the city. The operation gained momentum after a drive-by shooting at a birthday party, which prompted Chief of Police Daryl F. Gates to conduct a large-scale roundup of gang members. In April 1988, during the operation's peak, 1,453 individuals were arrested by 1,000 officers in South Central LA, now South Los Angeles, over a single weekend. January 30th, 1988, beyond these frequent clashes, there was the murder of 27-year-old Karen Toshima in a gang shootout in Westwood, which further fueled Operation Hammer. Toshima was walking with a friend on a busy street of Westwood Village, a popular shopping and entertainment district, when she was caught in the crossfire between rival gangs Westside Longos and the Venice Shoreline Crips. August 1st, 1988, a force consisting of 250 LAPD officers conducted a large-scale raid on 2 apartment buildings at the corner of 39th Street and Dalton Avenue, home of the Rolling 30 Harlem Crips. This massive operation, aimed at searching for drugs and demonstrating police power, resulted in significant property damage, including smashing furniture and vandalizing walls. The cops would cover this place with celebratory graffiti. Many residents were detained, humiliated, or beaten, though none were charged with a crime. This whole incident was sold as a pivotal movement against the war on drugs, but the raid wasn't very successful in terms of finding actual drugs. They found less than 6 ounces of marijuana and less than an ounce of cocaine. Weak. They also confiscated several guns and arrested 40 individuals suspected of belonging to the gangs. and took him into custody on suspicion of felony violations. Officer Todd Perrick, reflecting on the raid in 2001, stated, "We weren't just searching for drugs. We were delivering a message that there was a price to pay for selling drugs and being a gang member. This was just the beginning."
Nearly 1,500 people are rounded up and arrested. Dozens of officers raid apartment buildings, punching in walls, even leaving their own graffiti.
By 1990, over 50,000 people had been arrested in these raids, specifically in places like South Central LA, marking the highest arrest rates for young black men and women since the Watts riots of '65. However, despite the high arrest numbers, only 60 felony arrests were made in April 1988, with charges filed in just 32 cases. Chief Gates, however, claimed that charges were filed against 70% of those arrested. Now, critics accused Operation Hammer of racial profiling, targeting African Americans and Hispanic youths disproportionately. The perception of racial targeting contributed to the tensions that erupted in the 1992 LA riots, following the infamous Rodney King police brutality incident. Even when these series of raids positioned Operation Hammer as a consistent effort in the war against local gangs and their ties with drug trafficking in the U.S., in retrospect, received mixed evaluations regarding its effectiveness and its impact on street gangs in the broader community.
We're not hypocrites. We're going to condemn those people who casually use drugs in this nation. And we're going to condemn them in the worst way.
In a 2001 PBS interview, Chief Gates stated that while local residents often expressed gratitude, community activists accused the police of oppression. Gates defended the operation, asserting that the police were working to improve the quality of life in these communities, leaving aside the darker implications of excessive use of force, police brutality, racial profiling, and discrimination, a demonstrable effectiveness in long-term crime reduction, and the seeds of a massive state-driven xenophobic reaction that would later manifest in thousands of deportations. Operation Hammer didn't quite go as planned. Instead of wiping out gang activity, it kind of shuffled things around. Gangs got pushed out of one neighborhood and just set up shop in another. Now the cops were all over the place and gangs had to get crafty. They started operating undercover, changing their game, using codes, and meeting up in the shadows. On the other hand, all that pressure made the gangs stick together. They formed some alliances and even teamed up with Mexican drug cartels.
Let's end this war, so my people don't have to face that shooting war that they have to face each and every day, so our kids don't have to grow up in this kind of a society.
The operation's very small successes were completely overshadowed by its failure to address the root cause of gang involvement, maybe like poverty, lack of education, limited economic opportunities, to say the least. Many individuals remain trapped in a cycle of violence and crime, or sometimes simply ending up taking the problem to other countries, as we'll see later in this video. MS-13 versus President Nayib Bukele.
Mara Salvatrucha o MS-13 es una de las pandillas callejeras más famosas y temibles del continente americano. Se fundó en los barrios marginales de Los Ángeles, Estados Unidos.
When we think of Latin American-based gangs, looking past the Mexican cartels, that is, there isn't one organization that is larger or more dangerous than the multi-level, multi-country gang known as the Mara Salvatrucha, often abbreviated as MS, MARA, or MS-13. This is an international terrorist organization of criminal gangs whose activities include drug trafficking, extortion, contract killings, and lots more. They obviously originated in LA, California, and have expanded to other regions of the US, Latin America, and even as far as Southern and Western Europe. Members of MS are often distinguished by their tattoos covering body and face, as well as the use of their own sign language. They're known for their strict moral codes, consisting largely of excessive violence and cruel acts of vengeance. So cruel indeed that they were hired by the Sinaloa cartel, led by Guzman, to be trained in handling weapons and techniques to counter the force of Los Zetas or Gulf Cartel in a drug war that ruined the southern border of the U.S.
Expertos aseguran que el liderazgo de la MS-13 huyó a México porque en El Salvador se impone mano dura contra las pandillas.
MS-13's presence is notable in Central America, especially El Salvador. where they've clashed against President Bukele. After COVID-19 and Bukele's arrival to power, this criminal gang experienced a steep decline, with thousands of its members detained or expelled from the country in this unprecedented war between state forces and MS-13 cells. Now, this story goes way back before Bukele's election. You see, the problems in El Salvador didn't start with gangs. This Central American country has faced decades of turmoil. After enduring decades of military authoritarianism, El Salvador had plunged into a violent and prolonged civil war between 1979 and 1992, resulting in a tragic toll of 75,000 dead and missing, mostly civilians. Now, due to that conflict, tens of thousands of Salvadorans emigrated during the 70s and 80s. It's estimated that during the 80s alone, 92,000 of them moved to the U.S., mostly without resources, and these migrants had to settle in impoverished and dangerous neighborhoods in places like Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Houston. It was these areas that two of the most significant and dangerous Central American gangs were born: MS-13, founded by Salvadorans, and the 18th Street Gang, or Mata 18, initially founded by Mexicans but open to all Latinos, including many Salvadorans.
Muchos de esos refugiados terminaron asentándose en la principal ciudad de California, encontrando un nuevo hogar en los barrios del este y centro.
It didn't take long for the U.S. government to recognize how dangerous and aggressive these groups were, and to begin deporting many of their members en masse. An estimated 4,000 gang members were deported between 89 and 94. Back in El Salvador, these gangs reformed, now stronger than ever. In their homeland, a new era of violence was reborn, but this time it wasn't in the form of a civil war. These gangs, particularly MS-13 and Mara 18, engaged in various criminal activities. Extortion became rampant. For decades, thousands of business owners had to pay monthly fees to these gang members to avoid being killed. In areas controlled by gangs, this unwritten law, known as hear and keep quiet, prevailed. If you reported a crime committed by some gang, they would retaliate by raping your wife or daughter, or maybe just killing you.
Desde un comienzo, se exige a sus miembros fidelidad absoluta a la Mara y se los entrena para cometer asesinatos, violaciones, secuestros y extorsiones.
The brutality generated by these gangs forced many families to flee their homes and move to other parts of the country. It wasn't just about robbing someone's house or car. Gangs would demand that families give up their teenage sons to join them. Young girls were often taken to the gang leaders for forced sexual relations, leaving their parents helpless under the threat of death. This is how, for a long time, gangs like MS and Barrio 18 terrorized El Salvador, with record homicide rates, widespread extortion, and forced displacement of innocent citizens. Previous governments had attempted to combat these gangs, with some accused of negotiating with them to reduce violence, but everything changed after Bukele, coming into power in 2019, and promised to end this violence once and for all, without making any kind of deal with these people.
Si los pandilleros pensaban que enfrentaban a una fuerza armada hasta los dientes, no han visto a la Fuerza Armada que van a enfrentar de ahora en adelante.
March 2022, the MS-13 seemed to ignore these declarations, and a brief period of relative peace continued. But then a violent spike occurred between March 24th and March 27th, 2022, with 93 people murdered in the streets. This fueled the legislative approval of a state of emergency on March 27th, 2022. Allowing mass detentions of gang members. An exceptional period that was supposed to last only 30 days had extended month after month, and it was to ensure the deployment of thousands of police agents and military troops in surprise operations, leading to the imprisonment of approximately 65,000 citizens, allegedly associated with the Maras. The impact of Bukele's policies on El Salvador's crime rates had been nothing but dramatic. While in 2015 the country had a record peak of 103 murders per 100,000 inhabitants, by 2019, when Bukele took office, the rate had dropped to 36 per 100,000, and in 2022, it fell further to 7.8. Bukele publicly celebrated a historical streak of 300 days without a gang-related homicide. This significant security improvement resulted in his high approval rating, with a 90% approval in El Salvador and 92% favorability in Latin America as a whole. In early 2022, 2023, which led him to become the first president in El Salvador's history to be re-elected for a third mandate that'll end in 2029.
De agentes en operativos sorpresa a poblaciones enteras y ha encarcelado a cerca de 65,000 ciudadanos que el gobierno señala de pertenecer a las bandas criminales.
Now, a series of operations and exceptional measures have generated criticism and allegations of human rights violations. Since the implementation of the state of emergency on March 27, 2022, numerous cases of torture, arbitrary detentions, and deaths in penitentiary centers have been documented, reflecting the brutality of this tough-on-crime state policy. June 2022, the brutal anti-aging state policies were immediately effective. A group of 94 Mara Salvatrucha gang members were sentenced up to 1,090 years in prison for their involvement in all kinds of crimes, including the murder of 3 police officers. An important message we want to send to the gangs is that this will not go unpunished, and they will pay dearly for the murder of these 3 heroes who gave their lives to protect the population, said a state-related source. Several gang members were found guilty of 54 cases of serious crimes, including many aggravated homicides, and the verdict was issued by the Anti-Mafia Specialized Court. A representative of the prosecutor's office indicated that Cesar Alfredo Romero, national head of MS-13, received a sentence of 1,090 years, while the rest of his team received sentences up to 500 years. Among the convicted are all gang cell leaders, and some others with lesser rank in the criminal structure.
Detenciones arbitrarias, torturas, muertes bajo custodia policial o atacar la libertad de prensa son algunas de las violaciones.
Now, reports by Human Rights, Cristasol, revealed chilling details of what's happening with these alleged gang members behind bars. In Salvadoran prisons, at least 153 deaths have been recorded from March 2022 to April 2023. Many of these deaths were under violent circumstances and torture, including electric shocks and systematic beatings. Among the victims are individuals who were allegedly arrested with conclusive evidence of their gang affiliation and died without being tried. The state of emergency let Bukele detain people up to 15 days without formal charges, a measure that has facilitated mass detentions. Approximately 69,000 people have been arrested under this regulation, of which around 5,000 were released due to lack of evidence of gang affiliation. However, the conditions inside the prison are extremely harsh, and reports of torture are constant. Testimonies from former prisoners detail abuses like daily beatings, use of pepper spray, electric shocks, and medical neglect.
El traslado de 2,000 presos a la nueva prisión denominada Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, la mayor cárcel de toda América por su capacidad de confinar a 40,000.
August 22, 2023, the final symbol of the anti-gang war, the Terrorism Confinement Center, was inaugurated. The penitentiary center, capable of housing 40,000 detainees, currently holds over 12,000 suspected gang members. And once incarcerated, an imprisoned member of the MS-18 gang reflected on the mistakes of his past, noting, when you're a child, anyone can deceive you, sweeten things up, and you fall into an error. And when you grow up, you realize the mistake you've fallen into. Another inmate from the same gang expresses hope for change, saying, "We are persevering day by day, trying to change with the help of our God, trying to give a new image through our Lord Jesus Christ." The Terrorism Confinement Center, or CECOT, for its acronym in Spanish, is located in Tecoluca, about 70 kilometers from San Salvador, and it's one hell of a prison. Each cell, approximately 100 square meters in size, houses between 60 and 75 prisoners who have access to bunk beds, 2 toilets, and running water. The prison spans over 395 acres and is protected by an 11-meter concrete wall extending over 2 kilometers long with an electrified barbed wire. Bukele really doesn't want these guys to go anywhere. He practically laughs off those who critique his methods. Poor things, how we're violating their rights in prisons. Poor things, how we take away their mattresses. They didn't say anything when they took the lives of Salvadorans, when they robbed our country of its peace. when they made blood flow in our country and when they prevented our country from developing as it should. Because every business that opens, they go and extort. Despite the criticisms, President Bukele continues fostering his policy of military encirclement in specific areas of the country to combat these gangs. This is a controversial strategy, sort of raising doubts with its true intentions and effectiveness. But the recent operation in the department of Cabañas, which involved 7,000 soldiers and 1,000 police officers, is one example of these massive operations aimed at eliminating the presence of gangs, even if they have to instill fear among the civilian population. Now, one thing's for sure. El Salvador has never been safer than it is today, and these gangs messed with the wrong president.
Fue la tierra más peligrosa del mundo. Y ahora estamos en camino a ser el país más seguro de todo el continente americano.
Maras vs. Honduras, a Central American sequel. The crackdown on gangs in Honduras, locally known as the Régimen de Excepción, or State of Exception, commenced in December 2022 following the suspension of certain constitutional provisions aimed at combating criminal gangs within the country. As you might infer from the previous case, this is some sort of sequel inspired by Bukele's successful anti-Maras campaign in El Salvador. But of course, the Maras have been operating in the country for decades.
Con operativos en 17 barrios y colonias de Tegucigalpa. El resultado final fue de captura de 95 miembros de Maras.
MS-13's operations span across El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. They function through decentralized units known as clicas, operating independently in each region, making their own decisions regarding criminal endeavors. However, there are rivalries with other groups. The never-ending feud between different gangs like 18th Street and Mara Salvatrucha grew to unsustainable levels in Honduras. Daily murders multiplied in the country, and during the 90s, these organizations began to control territory where the state forces had no presence, reaching more than 90% of the country's municipalities. The state of emergency was a response to the escalating gang violence gripping the nation. Gangs were spiraling out of control, and the government took decisive action. December 3rd, 2022, the country's administration made a resolute proclamation. Certain constitutional rights would be suspended in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, the epicenters of gang activity. These cities bore the brunt of the gang's reign of terror, marked by extortion rackets and brutal reprisals against those who dared to defy their demands. The gangs, accused of extracting protection money from residents under the threat of violence, wielded immense power, pocketing a staggering estimated sum of $737 million annually, according to the Association for a More Just Society. December 6, 2022, the crackdown against the gangs erupted at 6 p.m. as this formidable force of 2,000 police officers penetrate the heart of gang-controlled territories in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula. The streets became battlegrounds, with law enforcement confronting the entrenched criminal networks head-on. Gustavo Sanchez, the Commissioner of National Police, who would later become Minister of Security, played a key role in implementing the state of exception, mobilizing law enforcement to confront the gangs directly. The crackdown involved deploying several thousands of police officers into these gang-controlled areas, conducting many arrests, and carrying out searches without warrants. Additionally, the government had built high-security prisons to detain the gangs and would authorize the use of military force to support police operations.
Para nosotros, mientras nos siga funcionando, vamos a seguir solicitando su ampliación.
In the face of crisis, Sanchez vowed to maintain the state of exception for 30 days. The gravity of the situation prompted President Zamora Castro to denounce the scourge of extortion, recognizing it as a catalyst for insecurity, mass migration, displacement, and economic stagnation. In a resolute declaration, she affirmed, "Extortion is one of the main causes of insecurity, migration, displacement, loss of freedom, violent deaths, and the closure of small and medium-sized businesses." With the comprehensive strategy against extortion and related crimes announced today by the National Police, This government of democratic socialism declares war on extortion. January 8, 2023, after the first few violent days, President Castro made the decisive move to prolong the state of exception by an additional 45 days due to the ongoing severity of the situation. This extension signified the government's unwavering commitment to uprooting the scourge of gang violence from the nation's soil. Subsequent extensions on the 21st of February and 8th of April 2023 reinforced the administration's resolve to confront the crisis head-on, leaving no room for compromise in the fight against criminals. So as the state of exception expanded its reach to encompass more than half of the nation's urban areas, the government ramped up its efforts. Law enforcement was empowered with additional resources. Fortifications were erected to contain the most dangerous offenders, and the streets became a battleground as security forces launched a relentless offensive. As if reflecting the state of lawlessness, arrests were made and searches were conducted without customary warrants, underscoring the urgency of the situation. But amidst the chaos, a brutal tragedy struck. On June 20th, a horrifying gang-related riot engulfed a women's prison in the town of Tamara, claiming the lives of at least 46 women in a grim display of violence. The following days only deepened this sense of anguish and despair, as reports emerged of a birthday celebration in the northern manufacturing city of Chaloma descending into a bloodbath. 13 individuals there, comprising of 12 men and 1 woman, were ruthlessly gunned down, plunging the community into mourning. Across the northern Sula region, at least 11 more lives were snuffed out in what appeared to be drug-related killings, further heating the climate of fear and uncertainty.
Hubo saña. Hubo una preparación previa para realizar lo que los pandilleros llaman esta pegada, de parte de una pandilla en contra de la otra.
This new wave of crimes led President Castro to take drastic measures. As she herself put it, she launches the Faith and Hope operation. Now, this initiative militarized most of the country's prisons, and the images shared by authorities immediately evoked memories of similar situations in El Salvador. Prisoners crowded on the floor in underwear, displaying their tattoos, all under the watchful eye of agents. This treatment, considered a clear violation of human rights, contrasts with the capture of high-caliber weapons, cell phones, homemade explosives, and ammunition seized during the operation in the prisons. In the wake of these horrible events, the government swiftly imposed stringent measures to restore order and prevent further bloodshed. A 15-day curfew was imposed in Chaloma, spanning from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m., effective immediately after that tragic incident. Similarly, San Pedro Sula found itself under curfew, slated to commence on the 4th of July. Additionally, rewards of over $30,000 were offered for any information leading to the capture of those responsible for the massacres. These measures, along with instruction for the armed forces to participate in construction of a penal farm on Sismo Island, aim to relocate members of Maras and other gangs, especially their most dangerous leaders. Just like we saw in El Salvador, these actions generated strong criticism from human rights organizations due to abuses against prisoners, including beatings, sleep deprivation, and restrictions on food and water. Complaints have also emerged against security forces for disproportionate use of force. Now, in the few months of Castro's tenure, homicides decreased by almost 13%, reaching a historic new low. However, since a state of emergency wasn't declared, the state's actions were heavily criticized. Despite the reductions in violence, the country remains one of the most dangerous in the region. Additionally, many question whether the measures are sustainable in the long term, considering they don't address the root causes like poverty and inequality, or even education and healthcare. So, did the crackdown work at all? Well, despite initial success in reducing the homicide rate, which fell from 38 per 100,000 inhabitants in 2022 to 31 in 2023, the operation did face challenge and criticism. Some experts argue that the crime reduction couldn't be solely attributed to that state of emergency. Furthermore, the crackdown did spark horrible incidents of violence that we already revised.
No cederemos ni un paso para cumplir con la misión que nos corresponde de proteger la vida y los bienes de todos los ciudadanos y ciudadanas.
Now, despite the complexities and challenges associated with the crackdown, the government is steadfast in its determination to take out gang violence and restore peace and security to Honduras, just like El Salvador did. This war is still being waged.